She was in a hospital bed, 3 days after surgery, holding a newborn daughter, when her husband's lawyer called to tell her the marriage was over. Not her husband, his lawyer. She had no job, no savings she could access, no home that was legally hers. And within 72 hours, someone was going to knock on the door and take her daughter too. Here is what the people doing this to her did not know. They did not know about the letter sitting in a Portland, Maine post office addressed to her that she had not opened yet. They did not know about a woman named Ruth, who had worked in the same office for 31 years and kept paper records of everything because she never trusted the cloud. They did not know that the woman lying in that hospital bed, with nothing but a legal pad and a phone, had spent 6 years learning exactly how people like them operated. And they did not know that in the space between losing everything and understanding why, something shifts in a person, something becomes very quiet and very precise. This is a story about what happens in that space. Stay with me, because the moment everything changes is not when the money arrives. It is much earlier than that, and it is something every one of us already has. What you are about to hear is not just a story about one woman. It is a blueprint for recognizing when you are being managed, for building a record when no one is watching, for understanding that the most powerful thing you possess has never been in anyone else's hands to take. If that is something you need today, you are in exactly the right place. And before we begin, if you have ever been told you were not smart enough, not strong enough, not worth the fight, this story is for you. Subscribe so you never miss one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, the share button is the most generous thing you can do in the next 5 seconds. I want to start at the end, not because the ending is the point of this story, but because without it, you might not believe what I am about to tell you, and I need you to believe it, because every single detail of what follows is true, and the truth of it matters more than the drama of it. October 14th, Suffolk County Probate Court, Massachusetts. A gray Tuesday morning with low clouds and the particular smell of autumn rain that the city gets in the weeks before everything turns cold for good. A woman sits at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal blazer she bought at a consignment shop on Newbury Street, $38. She has dark circles under her eyes that she has not bothered to conceal with makeup. Her hands rest on the table in front of her, completely still. Not the stillness of someone pretending to be calm. The stillness of someone who has already done every difficult thing and knows that this moment, right now, is simply the final paperwork on a war that is already over. Across the aisle, 4 attorneys in suits that cost more collectively than most people make in a year. The judge reads his ruling. The woman does not flinch. She does not look at the other table. She does not look at the cameras positioned at the back of the courtroom, because this case, by the time October arrives, has become the kind of case that draws cameras. She looks at a fixed point somewhere above the judge's left shoulder, and she breathes steadily, in and out. Later, a reporter will ask her what she was thinking in that moment. She will say, "I was thinking about January 9th, about the snow, about how cold my daughter's hands were." My name is not important to this story. I am the person who spent 14 months learning it, interviewing the people inside it, reading the documents and court filings and handwritten letters that make it real. What is important is her name, Sarah Whitmore. And what is important is what happened between January 9th and October 14th. It is not at its core a story about money. Though money is in it, it is not a story about revenge. Though justice is in it, it is a story about what happens when someone decides that being thrown away is not the same thing as being destroyed. Let me take you back to where it actually started. Not in a courtroom, in a hospital room. 3 days after her daughter was born, January 6th, St. Elizabeth's Medical Center, Boston. Sarah Whitmore had been in labor for 19 hours before the surgical team made the call for an emergency cesarean section. The procedure went smoothly, as these things go. Her daughter arrived at 11:47 in the evening, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with dark hair and a strong set of lungs and a faint yellowish tinge to her skin that the nursing staff told Sarah was common and not dangerous and would resolve on its own within the week. They placed the baby on Sarah's chest for 40 seconds before the monitors started making sounds that required attention. Then they took her to the warming unit, and Sarah lay on her back in a brightly lit room surrounded by people she had never met and looked at the ceiling and waited for the person who should have been there to arrive. He did not arrive. James Harrington III was not at the hospital when his daughter was born. He was not there the following day. He was not there the day after that. Sarah had been counting. 52 hours. The nurses gave her the particular look that medical staff develop when they have seen a version of a situation enough times to recognize it immediately, but are too professional to say what they are actually thinking. Sarah told herself he was busy with work. She told herself the pregnancy had been difficult and James had been stressed and this was simply his way of processing. She told herself the things that people tell themselves when the alternative is too large to look at directly. She had been telling herself stories about James Harrington for 3 years. She had become, without realizing it, very skilled at that particular form of self-deception. It was her friend Meg Sullivan who finally told her the truth. Meg came in through the side corridor at 7:30 in the evening on January 9th. She worked 2 floors below in the cardiac unit and had been checking on Sarah during her breaks since the night Sophie was born. She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, and something in the specific geometry of how she arranged herself, elbows on knees, hands folded, head slightly bowed, told Sarah before a single word was spoken that what was coming was going to require her to be very, very still. Meg said, quietly, "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." Sarah said, "Okay," Meg said. "He has been at the Marblehead house since at least September. Not alone. There is a woman named Vanessa Cole. She has been listed on the property filing for the house as a joint tenant since October." Sarah did not say anything. Meg said, "I found out this morning. I wanted to tell you myself because I did not want you to find out from your phone." Sarah looked at the bassinet where Sophie was sleeping. Sophie's fist was curled next to her cheek. She was making very small sounds. The sounds that newborns make when they are between states of consciousness. Not quite asleep. Not quite awake. Sarah picked up her phone. She opened the browser and typed James Harrington 3rd Marblehead property transfer, and the record came up in less than 4 seconds. Suffolk Registry of Deeds. Filed October 17th. James Harrington III and Vanessa A. Cole, joint tenants with right of survivorship. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She let it ring through to voicemail. She waited 30 seconds. She played the message. The voice was male, measured, professional. It said, "Mrs. Harrington. This is Alan Crow calling from Crow and Whitfield. I am calling on behalf of my client, James Harrington III. My client has authorized me to inform you that divorce proceedings will be initiated at the time of your discharge from St. Elizabeth's. A courier will deliver initial paperwork to whatever address you provide upon discharge. Please do not hesitate to call if you have questions." He had not called himself. He had sent a lawyer to his wife in the hospital room where their 3-day-old daughter was sleeping. Sarah set the phone face down on the bedside table. She looked at Meg. Meg looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a very long time. Then Sarah picked up her phone again, opened her notes application, and began to type. January 9th, 11:47 p.m. Voicemail from Alan Crow, Crow and Whitfield, acting on behalf of James Harrington III. Notification of intent to initiate divorce proceedings. She typed the property filing details. She typed the date. She typed Meg's name as a witness to the voicemail. She was a paralegal, 6 years at Donovan and Associates, Family Law Division, even in a hospital bed. 3 days post-surgery, the training held. Meg watched her do this and said nothing, because she understood, without needing it explained, that this was how Sarah was surviving the moment. Not by crying, not by calling James, by making a record. Later, much later, that record would matter more than almost anything else in this story. The nurse came in at midnight to check Sophie's jaundice levels. The number was improving. She would be cleared to go home in the morning. Sarah lay in the dark after the nurse left and thought about the word home, and understood that she no longer knew where that was. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you about the 3 years before the hospital room. Because what happened to Sarah Whitmore did not begin on January 9th. It began 3 years earlier, at a charity fundraiser in the Back Bay, on a Thursday evening in November, when she was 28 years old and James Harrington III walked up to the volunteer table where she was checking in guests and said, with a smile that she would later describe as genuinely warm, which was the part that made it so hard to see clearly, said, "You look like the most capable person in this room, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." She had laughed. He had stayed at the volunteer table for 20 minutes talking to her instead of going inside with his friends. 3 months later, they were engaged. 6 months after that, married at the Harrington family estate in Marblehead, a ceremony attended by 240 people, most of whom she had never met before that day. She had been in love. I want to be very clear about that. She had not been naive or foolish or blind to obvious signs. She had been in love with a man who, for those first several months, showed her a version of himself that was thoughtful and attentive and genuinely interested in who she was. The change was not sudden. That is the thing that people outside these situations rarely understand. It does not happen all at once. It happens the way water carves stone, slowly, incrementally, with results that only become visible after the damage is already deep. The first year, James suggested, gently, that her salary at the law firm was not worth the hours she was putting in, that they had enough between them. that she deserved to rest after working so hard for so long. She left the job, it felt, at the time, like a gift. The second year, her friendships began to thin. Not because James said anything explicitly negative about her friends. He was more sophisticated than that. He would simply be particularly warm and interested in her when they stayed home together, and particularly distracted and mildly disengaged on the evenings she came back from seeing Meg or her other friends from the firm. Slowly, without any single dramatic moment she could point to, the warmth became located in the house, in the Harrington world, and everywhere else felt slightly colder by comparison. The third year, she was pregnant, financially dependent, socially isolated to a circle of James's family and his family's friends, with a resume gap she would later have to explain. Living in a house that belonged to James, driving a car that belonged to James, on a household account that James managed. She had traded her life for an invitation to his, and she had done it so gradually that by the time she understood the shape of what had happened, she was already entirely inside it. Here is what I have learned from covering stories like Sarah's, and I am going to say this directly because I believe it matters beyond this particular story. Isolation rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as love, as protection, as preference. The warning signs are not dramatic. They are quiet. They sound like we should stay in tonight instead of I do not want you seeing those people. They sound like you do not need that job. I will take care of you instead of I want you to have no income of your own. They sound like my family is your family now instead of I am going to make you dependent on people who are loyal to me, not to you. The architecture goes up around you brick by brick while you believe you are building a home. If something in what I just described sounds familiar to you, I am asking you to stay with that feeling, because recognizing the blueprint is not a small thing. It is, sometimes everything. Now, back to the hospital, January 10th. Sarah was discharged at 10:45 in the morning. Meg had arranged for the loan of a portable car seat. The nursing staff helped bundle Sophie into it with the particular efficiency of people who perform this exact task many times each day. James had sent not himself, a black SUV with a driver named Robert who did not speak during the 40-minute drive from St. Elizabeth's to the Harrington family home in Brookline, the house where Sarah had lived for the past 3 years. Robert pulled up the drive. He came around and opened the door and helped Sarah out with Sophie's carrier. He did not make eye contact. She thanked him. He nodded and got back in the car and drove away. She stood on the front step with her 3-day-old daughter and her hospital bag and her notes application open on her phone, and she reached for the door handle, and it did not turn. The lock had been changed. She stood there for a moment. Then she heard the front door open, and she looked up, and there was Eleanor Harrington. James's mother was 63 years old, a woman of what used to be called a certain type in Boston's older social circles. Old money, good bones, a posture that communicated, at all times, that the space she occupied had been allocated to her by some arrangement that predated and superseded any temporary claims anyone else might make on it. She was dressed at 10:45 on a January morning, in gray wool trousers and a cashmere turtleneck, her silver hair arranged perfectly, a single strand of pearls at her neck. Behind her stood a man Sarah had never seen before, medium height, dark suit, leather briefcase. He had the expression of someone who has performed the task he was about to perform many times before and found it no more emotionally complicated than changing a tire. Eleanor said, "Sarah, come in out of the cold." It was the first time in 3 years that Eleanor Harrington had spoken to Sarah as though she were genuinely welcome in the house. That, Sarah told me later, was the detail that frightened her most. Eleanor led Sarah into the front sitting room, the room that Sarah had never been encouraged to use, the formal room, the one kept for guests and first impressions. Eleanor sat in the wingback chair nearest the fireplace. The man with the briefcase sat on the settee to Eleanor's left. Sarah sat across from them with Sophie's carrier on the floor beside her, one hand resting on the handle. Eleanor said, "This is Craig Donovan. He is a family attorney who has helped us navigate several matters over the years. He is here to help you understand your situation clearly so that we can all proceed with as little difficulty as possible," Sarah said. "My attorney is not present," Eleanor said. "Of course. You are welcome to have your own attorney review everything at a later stage. Craig is simply here to explain the documents so that you understand what James has agreed to." Craig Donovan opened his briefcase and laid a document on the coffee table between them. 17 pages, single-spaced, with the Crow and Whitfield letterhead at the top. He said, "This is a post-nuptial agreement that your husband signed in August of last year. It supersedes the prenuptial arrangement you signed before the wedding in terms of asset division. In essence, in the event of divorce, you would receive a settlement of $250,000, the contents of your personal wardrobe, and any items you brought to the marriage, and agreed upon child support per the state of Massachusetts formula schedule. Sarah looked at the document without touching it. She said, "I did not sign this." Craig Donovan said, "It is a post-nuptial agreement. Only one party's signature is required for filing in Massachusetts. Your signature is not necessary for its validity." She said, "That is not accurate." He paused, a very small pause. The kind that happens when someone has prepared for a version of a conversation that is not the one they are having. He said, "I assure you the document is entirely legal." She said, "A post-nuptial agreement in Massachusetts requires both parties to have independent legal counsel and full financial disclosure at the time of signing, or it is not enforceable. I would like the name of the attorney who advised me during this process, since I have no memory of meeting one." Eleanor's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. Craig Donovan said, "I think the important thing here is to keep this simple and clean for everyone involved, including the baby. James is prepared to be generous. The $250,000 is well above what most women in your position would receive." "Most women in your position." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I would like your bar number, please, for my records." He gave it to her. She typed it into her phone. Eleanor said, "Sarah, this is not a battle you want to have. James has resources that you simply do not have access to. We are trying to make this easy for you." "For Sophie," Sarah said. "I appreciate that. I would like to have my own attorney review these documents before we discuss anything further." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. It was the first time Sarah had seen Eleanor smile in a way that did not reach any feature of her face above the lips. She said, "Of course, take all the time you need." Then she said, "James will be in touch about the temporary arrangements for Sophie. We think it is best if she stays here, in the house, while you get yourself sorted out. You understand?" Sarah said very calmly, "Sophie stays with me." Eleanor said, "Well, we will see how the court sees it." She stood. Craig Donovan closed his briefcase. Eleanor walked them to the door with the air of a woman who had just completed a task and was ready to move on to the next one. Sarah stood in the sitting room alone with Sophie for a moment after they left. She looked at the 17 pages on the coffee table. She did not pick them up. She photographed each page individually on her phone. Then she sat back down and held Sophie's carrier with both hands and thought carefully about what had just happened. Here is what she understood in that moment, drawing on 6 years of paralegal work in a family law office. Craig Donovan was not her attorney. He had never been her attorney. He had been presented to her as a helper, but he had been sent by Eleanor, retained by Eleanor, briefed by Eleanor, and every piece of information she shared in that conversation had gone directly back to the Harrington family. She had been very careful. She had said almost nothing, but she had shown her hand on one thing. She had demonstrated that she knew enough to challenge the document's validity. She had asked for his bar number. Eleanor now knew that Sarah Whitmore was not going to be easy. That knowledge, Sarah told me later, was probably what triggered what came next. She called Meg from the car on the way to Meg's apartment in Cambridge, where Meg had already prepared the spare room with a borrowed bassinet and 2 weeks of groceries and a dehumidifier running because the room tended toward dampness in January. She said, "I need you to write down everything you saw at the hospital, every visit Eleanor made, every conversation you overheard, every nurse who can speak to the fact that James did not come. I need dates, times, names." Meg said, "Sarah, what is happening?" Sarah said, "What is happening is that I am building a case file, and I need to start tonight." She arrived at Meg's apartment at 2 in the afternoon. She laid Sophie in the bassinet. She sat at Meg's kitchen table with a legal pad and her phone, and she worked until 4 in the morning. By the time she stopped, she had 3 pages of dated entries, 2 screenshots from the property filing, a photographed copy of the postnuptial agreement, and the voicemail from James's attorney saved to 2 separate cloud accounts. She had, in the 12 hours since leaving the hospital, done something that would matter enormously later and that she did without knowing how much it would matter. She had created a record. She was a paralegal. Even at the worst moment of her life, the training held. For 48 hours after arriving at Meg's apartment, Sarah allowed herself something she had not felt since before the voicemail, the tentative, fragile sensation of having a plan. She had Meg. She had Sophie. She had documentation starting from January 9th. She had found the name of a family law attorney through the legal aid hotline number that Sophie's obstetrician, Dr. Patricia Walsh, had quietly pressed into her hand at discharge with 2 words written on the back of the card: "Call first." The attorney was a woman named Caroline Brooks, a solo practitioner in Cambridge who had spent 11 years in the Suffolk County family court system and had developed a very specific specialty: high-asset divorce cases where one party had significantly more institutional resources than the other. Sarah called her on January 11th. Caroline Brooks took the call herself. She listened for 22 minutes without interruption. Then she said, "I am going to need you to bring me everything you have. And I mean everything, in writing, organized by date. Can you do that? Sarah said. I already have it. Caroline Brooks said. Good. Come in tomorrow morning. For 48 hours, Sarah thought. I have a lawyer, I have documentation. I have a plan. The situation is terrible, but it is a solvable kind of terrible. And I know how to work within systems. And I am going to get through this. The knock on Meg's door came at 8:14 in the morning on January 13th. Two people. A woman in her 40s with a government-issued identification badge and the specific expression of someone carrying out a duty they did not author, but will carry out regardless. A uniformed Boston police officer beside her. The woman said, I am Linda Marsh. I am a caseworker with the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. I am looking for Sarah Whitmore. Sarah said, I am Sarah Whitmore. Linda Marsh said, Ms. Whitmore, we have received a report of concern regarding the welfare of a minor child in your care. We also have a court order, signed this morning by Judge Harold Bates of the Suffolk County Family Court, for the temporary placement of Sophie Ann Harrington with her father, James Harrington III, pending a full evaluation of your mental and emotional stability as a caretaker. Sarah stood in the doorway and did not say anything. The officer held up the document. It had a judge's signature. It had an official seal. It had Sophie's full name and date of birth, and the words emergency temporary custody transfer, which meant that the standard notification period had been bypassed. Linda Marsh said, I understand this is very difficult. If you would like to call an attorney, you are entitled to do so before we take the child. Sarah said, May I nurse her first? Linda Marsh said, Yes. She went into the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. Sophie was awake, looking up at her with the particular unfocused attention of a week-old infant, seeing shapes and light and the blur of a face she was only beginning to learn. Sarah nursed her for 12 minutes. She counted. She memorized the weight of her daughter in her arms. She looked at the line of Sophie's jaw and the small working motion of her mouth and the curl of her fingers against Sarah's chest. Then she stood up and carried Sophie to the living room and handed her to Linda Marsh. She did not cry, not in front of them. Meg, standing in the kitchen doorway, watched the front door close. Then she turned to Sarah. She said later that the only thing she could compare it to was watching someone receive news of a death, not hysteria. The stillness on the other side of hysteria. The place the body goes when the nervous system cannot process the thing that has just happened and simply stops. Meg said. Sarah said, call Caroline Brooks. Tell her what just happened. Tell her I need to be in court as soon as legally possible. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and picked up her legal pad and wrote, January 13th, 8:14 a.m. DCF caseworker Linda Marsh. Officer present, badge number 274. Court order signed by Judge Harold Bates. Sophie removed from care. She was at the worst moment of her adult life. She was writing it down. Here's what I want to tell you now, because what Sarah did in the hours after Sophie was taken is the thing that eventually changed the outcome of everything that followed. And I want to be very specific about it, because I believe it is genuinely useful. When a powerful family weaponizes an institution against you, the instinct is to respond emotionally, to call James and scream, to drive to Eleanor's house, to make noise, because noise feels like action, and action feels better than stillness. Sarah did none of those things. She did 4 things instead. She called her attorney and reported the exact time, names, badge numbers, and language used during the removal. While it was still fresh, she wrote a detailed account of Sophie's physical condition at the time of transfer, weight, feeding schedule, jaundice levels, medication if any, the specific blanket she was wrapped in, the car seat she was placed in. She found Linda Marsh's DCF supervisor's name and direct phone number through the public agency directory and documented it. And she began preparing a written response to the anonymous complaint that had triggered the emergency order, because emergency orders require a showing of imminent risk. And whoever had made that complaint had to have made specific allegations. And specific allegations could be challenged with specific evidence. The anonymous complaint, as Sarah would later learn through her attorney's discovery process, had been filed from a prepaid phone. It alleged that Sarah Whitmore was exhibiting signs of severe postpartum psychosis, that she had been making erratic statements at the hospital about unnamed people who were trying to harm her, that she had been observed by, quote, concerned family members behaving in ways that suggested she was a danger to herself and the child. It had been filed on January 11th. The same morning, Sarah had called Caroline Brooks and told her attorney about the postnuptial agreement and Craig Donovan. The timing, as Sarah noted in her case file, was not a coincidence. The custody hearing was scheduled for January 21st, 8 days away. Sarah spent those 8 days at Meg's apartment in Cambridge with her legal pad and her phone and Caroline Brooks, who turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney that her reputation suggested. meticulous, unflappable, and genuinely interested in winning. On January 14th, a certified letter arrived at Meg's apartment. Sarah had given the post office Meg's address as her official forwarding address the day she was discharged from St. Elizabeth's. One of approximately 40 administrative tasks she had completed in those first 48 hours. The letter was certified mail from an address in Portland, Maine. The return label read Whitmore and Associates Estate Law. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it. It took her 3 readings to understand what it was saying. Her maternal grandfather, Edward Whitmore, had died on January 12th, 2 days ago. She had met him twice in her life, once at her mother's funeral, when Sarah was 11, when a tall elderly man with kind eyes had found her standing alone near the coat room and had said, "Gently, you have your mother's eyes," and had given her a silver dollar from his jacket pocket, once at a family gathering when she was 8, which she remembered only in fragments, a large house somewhere near water, the smell of wood smoke, a golden retriever that followed her from room to room. Her mother, Anne Whitmore Morgan, had left her family at 19 over a disagreement whose specifics Sarah had never fully learned. She had moved to Boston with Sarah's father, who left when Sarah was 4. She had worked and raised Sarah alone and had never, as far as Sarah knew, spoken to her family again. Sarah had grown up understanding that her grandfather was alive somewhere in Maine. She had assumed, as people do with estranged relatives they have never truly known, that this was simply a piece of her history that did not belong to her present. The letter explained, in the careful formal language of estate attorneys, that Edward Whitmore had died at 82 years old after a brief illness. It explained that his estate was in the process of being transferred to the sole named beneficiary in his will. It explained that this beneficiary was Sarah Catherine Morgan Whitmore. The estate, the letter continued, included the operating assets of Whitmore Financial Advisors, a regional wealth management firm founded in 1974, 3 residential properties in Maine and Vermont, a portfolio of securities and investment accounts, total appraised value, pending formal inventory, $340 million. Sarah set the letter down on Meg's kitchen table. She picked it up and read it again. She set it down again. She called into the kitchen. "Meg, can you come in here for a second?" Meg came in, drying her hands on a dish towel. Sarah said, "I need you to read this and tell me if I am reading it correctly." Meg read it. She looked up. She read it again. She said, "Sarah, this is real." Sarah said, $340 million. Meg said, $340 million. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table in a Cambridge apartment in January, with the radiator making its particular sound and the letter between them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Sarah said, "I need Thomas Blackwood." Meg said, "Who is Thomas Blackwood?" Sarah said, "The best estate and family law attorney in Boston. I have processed 3 cases that went through his office. He wins." She called him the following morning. She explained the situation in 12 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Can you be in my office tomorrow at 9? She said, "Yes." He said, "Bring the estate letter, every document you have from the divorce proceedings, and your notes from the hospital forward, all of it." She said, "It is organized by date." He said, "Good." Thomas Blackwood retained her on a $15,000 advance drawn from the estate, a transaction that the estate attorney in Portland confirmed was legally permissible as an emergency draw against inheritance funds pending full probate. He filed immediately for custody reinstatement, presenting the court with Sarah's financial stability, her clean psychiatric history, her documentation from the hospital, and evidence that the DCF complaint had been filed anonymously from an unregistered device. The same morning, Sarah had consulted an attorney about the post-nuptial agreement. January 21st, Family Court. Judge Miriam Santos. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Judge Santos reviewed the documentation. She reviewed the emergency order and the circumstances under which it had been granted. She asked 4 direct questions of the DCF caseworker, Linda Marsh, who answered them with the particular careful honesty of someone who had, in 8 days, developed her own doubts about the situation. Judge Santos ruled in Sarah's favor. Emergency custody reinstated. Sophie to be returned to Sarah Whitmore's care by end of business. Thomas Blackwood shook Sarah's hand on the courthouse steps. The January sky was pale and cold. Sophie came home to Meg's apartment that afternoon, wrapped in the same blanket she had left in. For 3 days, Sarah Whitmore believed the worst was behind her. She held Sophie and slept and ate and began to let herself believe in the outline of a future. She was wrong in ways she could not yet imagine. The knock on Meg's door at 2:17 in the morning on February 5th did not sound like a knock made by someone who wanted to be there. It was too quick, too deliberate. Not the rhythm of an emergency, not the rhythm of a neighbor, the rhythm of a task. Sarah was a light sleeper. She had been a light sleeper since Sophie came home. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious. She went to the window first. She looked down at the street. One car, parked across the road with its lights off. She went to Sophie's bassinet and picked her up. Sophie made a small sound and settled against her shoulder. Then Sarah went to her bag and took out her phone and called 911 and said, "I think someone is breaking into my apartment. I have an infant. Please hurry." Then she went to the bedroom and locked the door and stood with her back against it, with Sophie in her arms, until she heard the front door of the apartment open and sounds of movement in the living room. And then, 4 minutes later, the knock of the officers who had arrived. She opened the bedroom door. The apartment had been gone through quickly, efficiently, and with complete focus on specific items. Her laptop, her external hard drive, a manila folder on Meg's kitchen counter that contained printed copies of every document she had assembled since January 9th. Left untouched, Meg's laptop, Meg's jewelry in the dish on the dresser, $340 in cash in the kitchen drawer, Sophie's diaper bag. This was not a burglary. This was a retrieval. Sarah sat on the kitchen floor with Sophie in her arms while the officers took their report, and she understood, with the same clear-eyed quality that had made her good at her paralegal work, that someone had decided the most efficient solution to Sarah Whitmore was to erase the record she had been building. What they had not known, because she had not told anyone, was that every digital document she had was backed up to 3 separate locations. 2 cloud accounts under an email address she had created the day she left St. Elizabeth's, and a USB drive that she kept in the inside pocket of her winter coat at all times, because she had watched enough cases in family court to know that physical possession of evidence is the only possession that cannot be hacked. They had taken her laptop. They had not taken what mattered. But this was not the end of what that week cost her. February 8th, probate court. Preliminary hearing on the Whitmore estate. James Harrington's attorney, a man named Philip Webb who charged $800 an hour and had the courtroom confidence of someone who had never lost a case he cared about, presented a document, a second will, dated August 12th of the previous year, 5 months before Edward Whitmore's death, signed, notarized, and filed with the Whitmore estate attorney in Portland. This will, Philip Webb explained, superseded the previous document. It left the entirety of the Whitmore estate to an entity called the New England Heritage Charitable Foundation. The foundation's board chair and primary beneficiary was a man named Harrison Webb. Harrison Webb was James Harrington III's godfather and Robert Harrington's business partner of 18 years. The probate judge issued a stay. All Whitmore estate assets frozen pending a full forensic evaluation of the competing wills. Timeline, 4 to 8 months. The following day, Philip Webb filed a new custody motion in family court. With the estate frozen, Sarah had no accessible income. With no income, her financial stability argument, the central pillar of Thomas Blackwood's custody case, collapsed. The new filing argued that Sophie deserved a stable home environment with a financially secure parent, and that Sarah Whitmore's current circumstances, no independent income, no permanent housing, no certainty about her financial future, did not meet that standard. The hearing was before a different judge than the first one, Judge Leonard Marsh, no relation to the DCF caseworker, who had a reputation for prioritizing what he called structural stability in custody decisions. He reinstated temporary custody with James Harrington, pending the resolution of the estate proceedings. Sarah stood outside the Suffolk County Courthouse on a February morning with Thomas Blackwood on her left and Meg on her right and the temperature at 19 degrees, and watched a driver she did not know put Sophie's carrier in the back of a black SUV that pulled away from the curb without stopping. She had won the first round. She had lost the second and the third in the same week. She had no laptop, no physical documents, a frozen estate, no custody of her daughter, and was living in her friend's spare room. For the first time since January 9th, she did not immediately pick up her phone to document what had happened. She stood on the sidewalk in the February cold for 60 seconds. Exactly 60 seconds, Meg counted. Then she said, "Tell me everything you know about Harrison Webb." Thomas Blackwood called her 3 days later and said, "I need you to come in, and I need you to hear all of what I am about to tell you before you respond. Can you do that?" She said, "Yes." She sat across from him in his office on the 14th floor of a building in Post Office Square with Boston Harbor visible through the windows behind him, gray and flat in the February light. He said, "Craig Donovan has been sharing information with the Harrington legal team." She said, "I know," he said. "Every conversation you had with Donovan in those first days after the hospital, the questions you asked, the documents you mentioned, the fact that you knew the postnuptial agreement's enforceability was questionable. All of it went directly back to Eleanor Harrington's team within 24 hours of you saying it." She said, "I know, I gave him almost nothing. I was careful." Thomas Blackwood looked at her steadily. He said, "That is not the part I need you to hear." He opened a folder on his desk. He said, "We retained a forensic document specialist 3 days ago to examine the second will. She found metadata embedded in the document file from the PDF that was submitted to the probate court alongside the physical copy. Metadata that shows the document was created using a word processing template from the Whitmore Estate Attorney's Office in Portland," she said. "How would someone outside the Portland office have access to that template?" he said. "Because Craig Donovan was introduced to the Whitmore estate attorney 14 months ago as a co-counsel brought in to advise on estate restructuring. Harrison Webb brought him in. He had full access to the Portland office's files for 6 months. Sarah was quiet," Thomas Blackwood said. "Craig Donovan did not draft just your husband's divorce strategy. We believe Craig Donovan drafted the second will, using the Whitmore estate's own templates against itself," she said. "Edward knew something was wrong," Blackwood said. "What do you mean?" she said. In the certified letter from the estate attorney, there was a reference to a letter Edward had written to his own attorney 2 months before he died. It was listed in the estate inventory as a personal correspondence document. "I asked the Portland attorney to send me a copy. He sent it last week. I have it with me." She opened her bag and took out a folded piece of paper. She had printed it at the library 3 blocks from Meg's apartment because she no longer had a printer. She unfolded it and laid it on Thomas Blackwood's desk. Edward Whitmore's handwriting, shaky in places, the handwriting of an 81-year-old man who was not well, but legible, dated October 3rd. It said, "I am writing to express concern about several documents I have been asked to review in recent months related to the restructuring of my estate plan. I have felt pressure from outside parties that I cannot fully characterize, but that does not feel in keeping with what I intended for my legacy. I do not feel I am in a position to be more specific at this time, but I want this concern documented. I do not want what I built to end up somewhere I did not choose." Thomas Blackwood read it twice, he said. He knew something was wrong, but he did not know enough to stop it, she said. He was 81, and he was being managed by people who were much more sophisticated than he was, and who had been working on this for at least a year. He was not naive, he was outgunned. She paused, then she said, "How many others?" He said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "If this is a system, if Craig Donovan and Harrison Webb built a method for doing this, Edward Whitmore was probably not the first. How many others?" Thomas Blackwood looked at her for a moment. He said, "I do not know, but I think someone should find out." She said, "I think a journalist should find out." He said, "I know someone at the Globe." She said, "Call him." What Sarah understood in that office, and what she wanted me to be clear about when she told me this part of the story, was that the moment the shape of the full situation became visible to her, her focus changed entirely. It stopped being about her, or rather, it became about something larger than her, in a way that paradoxically made her part in it clearer and more manageable. She was not just a woman fighting a divorce. She was a person with documentation standing in the way of a fraud that had likely been committed against multiple families. That reframing from victim to witness, from isolated target to key piece of a larger legal picture, was not a comfort, it was a strategy. When you understand that what is being done to you is a pattern, you stop trying to fight it as a personal attack. You start trying to expose it as a system. And systems are much harder to hide than individual stories. Portland, Maine, February 18th. Sarah drove Meg's car 3 hours north on I-95 on a Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee and the USB drive in her coat pocket. She had found the name through the estate attorney's inventory. Ruth Caldwell, Administrative Director, Whitmore Financial Advisors, 1993 to present, 31 years with the same company. The address was above a hardware store on a street 2 blocks from the waterfront. Sarah climbed a narrow staircase and knocked on a frosted glass door with the name Whitmore Financial Advisors still on it in gold letters. Even though the firm had technically ceased independent operations following Edward's death, the woman who opened the door was 67 years old, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a photograph of a golden retriever on her desk, and the specific quality of permanent alertness that people develop who have spent decades being responsible for things other people considered too small to notice. She looked at Sarah for a moment. She said, "You have your mother's eyes." Edward always said that. Sarah sat across from her and told her the complete story. The divorce, the postnuptial agreement, Craig Donovan, the DCF complaint, the second will, Harrison Webb, the metadata. She laid it out in the order it had happened, and she did not editorialize, and she did not ask for anything while she was telling it. When she finished, Ruth Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harrison Webb first came to this office 17 months ago. He came in very smooth, very warm. Lots of talk about legacy, about preserving what Edward had built, about the complexity of managing a firm of this size without a succession plan in place. Edward was 81. He was tired in the way that very old people who have worked very hard their whole lives get tired. He wanted to believe that someone capable was going to take care of things. She said, I did not trust Harrison Webb the first time I met him. I could not have told you then why. I want to be honest about that. It was not anything specific. It was the way he spoke about the firm as though it were already his. The way he referred to the clients as a portfolio rather than as people. Edward had clients who had been with this firm for 40 years. Harrison Webb talked about them like assets on a spreadsheet, Sarah said. Did you keep records of his visits? Ruth Caldwell said. I keep records of everything. Edward always said if it is important. It exists on paper first. She stood and took her coat from the hook by the door. She said, come with me. They drove 4 minutes to a commercial storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Ruth led her to a unit on the second level and unlocked it with a key on a lanyard around her neck. Inside, floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, archival boxes labeled by year, going back to 1989. Ruth walked to the shelf marked 2022 through present and pulled out 3 boxes. She said, every version of every document Edward signed, every meeting that took place in this office, every email printed and filed, because I have never trusted email servers. Every copy of every will Edward ever executed, including the original that named you as sole beneficiary, witnessed by myself, by Edward's personal physician, and by a notary whose full contact information is on the signature page. Sarah looked at the boxes. She said, is there anything else? Ruth Caldwell said, there is one more thing. 2 months before he died, Edward asked me to be in the room for a meeting with Harrison Webb and Craig Donovan. He said he wanted a witness. I sat in the corner and I took notes, longhand. Craig Donovan did not acknowledge that I was there. I do not believe he knew my name. In 12 years of coming to this office, I do not believe Harrison Webb ever learned my name. She reached into the third box and removed a spiral notebook. She said, I wrote down everything they said, verbatim, as close as I could get it, including the part where Craig Donovan's explained to Edward that the new charitable foundation arrangement would protect the firm's legacy while still providing Sarah, and he used your name, with quote appropriate support. And Edward said, and I wrote this down exactly, I want my granddaughter to have what I built. I do not want appropriate support. I want her to have it. And Donovan said, of course. That is exactly what this arrangement accomplishes. She looked at Sarah, she said. He looked directly at Edward and lied to his face. And Edward was tired and old and wanted so badly to believe that everything was being handled that he let himself believe it. Sarah took the notebook from her carefully. The way you take something that is both fragile and essential. She said, Ruth, will you testify? Ruth Caldwell said. I have been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 2 months. There is something I want to say about Ruth Caldwell, because she is in many ways the reason this story ends the way it does, and because she is exactly the kind of person who never appears in the version of the story that gets told when powerful people control the narrative. She was not a lawyer. She was not an investigator. She was an administrative professional who had done the same job for 31 years and who had, out of habit and instinct, and a fundamental belief that records matter, kept physical copies of everything. She was the person no one had thought to manage. In my experience covering situations where powerful people do harmful things, there is almost always a Ruth Caldwell, the long-term employee, the person who has been in the same position so long that they are effectively invisible to the people at the top, the person who knows exactly where everything is, because no one ever told them to get rid of it. If you are ever in a situation where you need to establish truth and you do not know where to start with the person everyone forgot to worry about. They remember everything. The Forensic Document Examiner's report was filed with the probate court on February 28th. The findings were detailed and unambiguous. The signature on the second will was inconsistent with Edward Whitmore's authenticated signatures across 47 other documents spanning 3 decades. The paper stock was a variant discontinued by the Portland printer before August of the previous year, making the August date impossible. The notary stamp did not correspond to any licensed notary in the state of Maine. The second will was a forgery. Thomas Blackwood presented the findings alongside Ruth Caldwell's notebook, the physical copies from the storage unit, and Edward Whitmore's letter to his attorney. He presented a sworn affidavit from Edward's personal physician, confirming that Edward had been mentally competent and clear in his intentions regarding his estate as recently as 90 days before his death. March 2nd, Probate Court. Judge Ann Cahill ruled that the second will was invalid. The Whitmore estate would proceed to probate under the original document. Sarah Catherine Morgan Whitmore was the sole beneficiary. Thomas Blackwood shook her hand in the corridor outside the courtroom. Ruth Caldwell, who had driven 3 hours from Portland that morning, stood beside them and said very little. She was not a woman who made much of moments like this. She had simply done what needed to be done. And now it was done, and that was enough for her. Sarah went back to Meg's apartment. She slept for 14 hours. She allowed herself for 72 hours to breathe, to think about getting Sophie home, to think about what came next. On the 73rd hour, Meg knocked on her bedroom door at 7 in the morning and said, "Sarah, turn on the television." The segment had aired on the 6 o'clock morning news on Channel 7 Boston. Eleanor Harrington sat in a cream-colored living room in what appeared to be the Marblehead house, dressed in soft gray cashmere, her pearls at her throat, her hands folded in her lap. She looked, to anyone who did not know her, like someone's elegant and concerned grandmother. The interviewer asked about the probate ruling. Eleanor said, "We respect the court's process, of course. But I think there is a larger picture here that the ruling does not address. Edward Whitmore was a wonderful man in decline. He was, in his final months, isolated from his usual support network and susceptible to influence from people who did not have his best interests at heart. We have concerns, which we have expressed through proper channels, about the circumstances under which this will was created and who had access to Edward during that period," the interviewer said. "Are you suggesting that Sarah Whitmore influenced her grandfather improperly?" Eleanor said, with the particular care of someone who has rehearsed this exact answer. "I am simply saying that an 81-year-old man who had not seen his granddaughter in 20 years suddenly changes his estate plan to leave everything to that granddaughter, and that granddaughter simultaneously has significant legal and financial motives arising from her divorce from my son, and I think it is natural and appropriate to ask questions. We only want what is best for Sophie. That has always been our only concern." The segment ran 7 minutes. By 9 that morning, it had been clipped and posted across 11 platforms. By noon, it had 400,000 views. By evening, Sarah Whitmore's name was attached to the words "gold digger" and "elder abuse" in comment sections across the internet. Sarah watched the segment once. Then she turned off the television. She called Thomas Blackwood. She said, "I need you to do 2 things. First, file the emergency custody reinstatement motion today. We have the estate. We have Ruth's testimony. We have the forensic report. Use all of it. Second, give me Daniel Reeves's number," Blackwood said. "The Globe reporter," she said. "You told me 2 weeks ago you knew someone there. I need to meet with him, not to respond to Eleanor. To give him what we found about the full pattern. Harrison Webb, Craig Donovan, the other families." Blackwood said, "Sarah, I want to be careful here. If this becomes a media story before the custody hearing," she said. "The custody hearing is in 3 weeks. A federal fraud investigation takes months to open. The 2 timelines are separate. I am not giving Reeves anything about custody. I am giving him the estate fraud pattern because it is a true story that deserves to be told, and because the families who were victimized before Edward deserve to have it exposed. Can you give me his number?" Blackwood gave her the number. "She called Daniel Reeves that afternoon," she said. "I have documentation of an estate fraud scheme operating across New England that has targeted at least one elderly man and likely several others. I can give you names, dates, physical records, and a sworn witness who was in the room." "Are you interested?" Reeves said. "When can you meet?" she said. "Tomorrow morning." She spent 11 days saying nothing publicly. Not one response to any media coverage. Not one social media post. Not one statement. She did not defend herself. Did not explain herself. Did not engage with any of the commentary Eleanor's interview had generated. During those 11 days, she met with Daniel Reeves 3 times. She gave him the documents, the notebook, the forensic report, the metadata findings, and Ruth Caldwell's direct contact information. She gave him names of other potential victims she and Thomas Blackwood had identified through records from the Portland office and Harrison Webb's professional history. Reeves spent the 11 days making calls. He found 7 families, 7 estates across New England over 6 years, all with variations of the same pattern. Harrison Webb inserting himself into the planning process for an elderly client. Craig Donovan providing legal infrastructure. New documents appearing, assets redirecting. Edward Whitmore was not the first. He was the one who had left behind a granddaughter who happened to be a paralegal, and a longtime employee who happened to keep paper records, and a forensic document specialist who happened to notice a discontinued paper stock. The Boston Globe story ran on April 3rd. Front page, above the fold. The headline read, "Estate Attorney Network Targeted Vulnerable Seniors Across New England." Sarah provided one statement, 47 words. Read aloud by Thomas Blackwood at a press conference she did not attend. "My grandfather built something over 50 years that he intended to leave to his family. What was done to him was done to at least 7 other families. I hope the full accounting provides all of them some measure of justice." Within 48 hours of publication, the FBI opened a formal investigation. Craig Donovan's law license was suspended pending investigation. Harrison Webb surrendered his passport. The injunction on the Whitmore estate was dissolved. March 22nd, Family Court. The custody hearing before Judge Santos, the same judge who had heard the first case. Thomas Blackwood presented the restored estate proceedings. Sarah's documented stable income and housing. Ruth Caldwell's written statement about Sarah's character as described to her by Edward in his final months. And a simple fact, every institutional concern raised by the Harrington family in their custody arguments had been predicated on Sarah's financial instability, which had itself been manufactured by the fraudulent second will, Judge Santos said. The court finds that the circumstances giving rise to the earlier temporary custody arrangement have been fully resolved and that no credible evidence exists to suggest that Sophie Ann Harrington is at risk in her mother's care. Full custody returned to Sarah Whitmore. Supervised visitation for James Harrington pending review of his cooperation with the federal investigation. Sophie came home that afternoon. Meg was there. Ruth Caldwell had driven down from Portland for it. Thomas Blackwood sent a text that said simply, "Well done." Sarah held her daughter and did not say anything for a long time. October 14th, Suffolk County Probate Court. The morning I described at the very beginning. Sarah Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal blazer she had bought at a consignment shop on Newbury Street for $38. Her hands were completely still. Her eyes were on a fixed point above the judge's left shoulder. Judge Cahill read the final probate ruling. The Whitmore estate transferred in full to Sarah Catherine Morgan Whitmore. $340 million in assets, minus applicable taxes, estate fees, and legal costs, now accessible, legally clear, and entirely hers. The Harrington family's 4 attorneys sat across the aisle and said nothing. After the session concluded, in the corridor outside the courtroom, a reporter caught Sarah on her way to the elevator and asked, "What were you thinking in there?" She said, "I was thinking about January 9th, about the snow, about how cold my daughter's hands were," the reporter said. "And how does it feel now?" Sarah looked at her for a moment. She said, "It feels like the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. Ask me again in a year." What happened to the people in this story after October 14th is worth knowing. Not as satisfaction, though I understand why some people feel it that way, but as a record. Harrison Webb was convicted on 3 counts of elder financial fraud in federal court the following March. The 6 other families received settlements from the liquidation of his assets. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. Craig Donovan was disbarred and faced federal charges as a co-conspirator. He took a plea agreement that required full cooperation with the investigation into all 7 cases. The other 6 families, the ones Reeves had found, received a combination of restitution from Webb's assets and, in 2 cases where the fraud had been successfully completed before it could be challenged, a contribution from the Whitmore Foundation, which Sarah established in the first month after the probate ruling. Eleanor Harrington faced no criminal charges. The court record noted that the DCF complaint had been made maliciously and without factual basis. Her reputation in the social circles she had occupied for 40 years was, as far as anyone could determine, her primary ongoing concern. The Marblehead House was sold as part of the Harrington family's financial restructuring following Robert Harrington's civil penalties for his role in the estate fraud network. James Harrington III called Sarah on a Thursday afternoon in November and asked if they could meet, not through lawyers, just the 2 of them, at a coffee shop in Back Bay. She almost said no, she went. He looked like someone who had spent 10 months watching the consequences of choices he had made, or failed to make, accumulate into something he could no longer rationalize. He looked, she told me, genuinely ashamed. He said, "I did not know about the will. I did not know any of it. I know that does not change what happened." She said, "No, it does not." He said, "I want to be Sophie's father, a real one, not what I was." She studied him for a long time. She said, "That is not my decision to make. It is Sophie's, eventually. What I need from you right now is a custody agreement drafted by my attorney, signed without modification, that makes Sophie's welfare the organizing principle of every provision. If you can do that, we have somewhere to start." He signed it in December, without modification. She did not forgive him. She did not need to. She made a legal structure that required his words to become actions before they counted for anything, and she put Sophie at the center of it, and she let time determine the rest. I think that is one of the most sophisticated things she did in a story full of sophisticated things. She did not let her entirely justified anger at James determine Sophie's relationship with her father. She created conditions under which James could either demonstrate change or not, and she stepped back and let the conditions do the work. Justice is not the same as destruction. She understood that. Some people who have been through what she went through do not, and I do not blame them for it. But the distinction mattered for Sophie, and in the end, what mattered for Sophie was the point. Sarah enrolled in evening law school in September, Boston University, 3 nights a week. She had always wanted to be a lawyer. James had told her she was not smart enough, and she had, over 3 years, allowed that assessment to settle somewhere in her. She was pulling it out now and examining it in the light and finding it exactly as false as everything else he had told her. The Whitmore Foundation opened its doors in November with an initial endowment of $3 million. Its specific focus: legal representation for low-income individuals in high-asset divorce and custody proceedings where one party has significantly greater institutional resources than the other. The situations where money and connections win, not because they are right, but simply because they can afford to keep going longer. Ruth Caldwell accepted the position of Director of Operations. She said she was glad to have something useful to do. And Sophie Ann Harrington, who by October was 9 months old and had recently discovered that pulling herself up to standing against the side of her crib was both possible and enormously satisfying, was by all accounts healthy, happy, and entirely unaware of the year that had just occurred around her, which was, Sarah said, exactly as it should be. Now I want to spend the last few minutes of this story talking not about what happened, but about what it means. Because I think this story is often misread when people focus on the inheritance, the money, the estate, the legal victory. Sarah Whitmore did not win because she inherited money. She won because of decisions she made before that inheritance was accessible. When she had nothing, when she was in a hospital room with 52 hours of abandon waiting behind her and a voicemail from a lawyer and a 7-pound daughter who had no idea what world she had been born into. Let me be specific, because I believe the specific things are what actually matter. The first thing she did was document from minute one, not because she knew what was coming. Because she was a paralegal and documenting was how she processed the world. You do not have to be a paralegal to do this. Your phone has a notes application. Use it. Date and time every interaction that feels wrong. Write down what was said and who was present. You may never need it. Or it may be the thing that saves you. The second thing she did was refuse to accept help she had not chosen. Craig Donovan was handed to her as assistance. He was a weapon aimed at her. Before you accept legal, financial, or institutional guidance from anyone in a crisis, ask yourself who recommended this person. Who are they connected to? Whose interests have they historically served? The most dangerous help is the help that comes unsolicited from the other side. The third thing she did was find Ruth Caldwell. She thought to look for the person who was overlooked. The woman who had been in the same role for 31 years and knew where everything was because no one had thought to manage her. There is a Ruth Caldwell in almost every situation where powerful people are doing something wrong. The overlooked employee, the longtime assistant, the person who kept the paper files because they never trusted the cloud. Find that person. They have what you need. The fourth thing she did was control her own timeline. When Eleanor appeared on television and the internet filled with people calling her names, Sarah said nothing. For 11 days, she did not respond on anyone else's timeline. She gathered her evidence and spoke once, with documentation, and then she was done. In a world where the pressure to respond immediately to any public accusation is enormous, the ability to be strategically silent is one of the most powerful tools available. Use it. The fifth thing, and this is the one I keep returning to, when James came to her with something genuine, accountability, a legal commitment, the willingness to actually show up for Sophie, she evaluated it on its own terms. She did not let her entirely valid anger at what had happened prevent her from seeing what was actually being offered. She created a structure, the custody agreement, the involvement of her attorney, the clear conditions, and she let time and behavior determine the rest. She chose Sophie over the satisfaction of a total severance, and that choice was not weakness. It was the most powerful thing in the story. I want to say something about the money because I think honesty requires it. The inheritance helped enormously. It gave Sarah access to Thomas Blackwood and the time to fight without simultaneously worrying about rent and food. I am not going to pretend the outcome would have been identical without it. But Edward Whitmore's money did not give Sarah the ability to document carefully. It did not give her the instinct to recognize Craig Donovan as a conflict of interest before she gave him anything that could be used against her. It did not give her the thought to call Ruth Caldwell, or the discipline to stay silent for 11 days while Eleanor's interview was circulating. It did not give her the understanding that James was capable of choosing differently, or the wisdom to create a structure in which that choice could be made real. Those things were Sarah's. They were always Sarah's. She had simply spent 3 years in a marriage that systematically told her they were not. The cruelest thing that can be done to a capable person is not open harm. Open harm can be resisted, documented, survived. The cruelest thing is the quiet, consistent, years-long process of convincing someone that their capabilities are nothing, that they need to be managed. that their instincts are wrong, that their judgment cannot be trusted, that the life they built before belongs to a lesser version of themselves. Eleanor Harrington did not throw Sarah into the snow. She spent 3 years building a world in which Sarah believed she belonged there. The inheritance was a door. Sarah had always been the key. If you are in your own version of this story, if you have been systematically separated from your own competence, your own voice, your own understanding of your worth, I want to say this directly and clearly. Those things do not leave. They go quiet. They wait. The skills you had before are still yours. The person you were before is still present. You are not the thing they called you when they were trying to keep you manageable. You are not the version of yourself they needed you to be so that the world could work the way they wanted it to. You are who you were, and possibly someone considerably more. Sarah Whitmore told me when we spoke for the last time before this story was complete that the thing she thinks about most often from that entire year is not the courtroom, and it is not the estate, and it is not Eleanor's expression in the probate hearing. She thinks about the 48 hours before the knock on Meg's door. The 48 hours when she had a plan and a legal pad and a newborn daughter and nothing else. And she felt in that fragile, specific way, like she might be able to do this. She said, I was right. I just did not know yet how long right was going to take. I have heard a lot of stories. I have been doing this for a long time. I do not often find a detail that I keep returning to, but that one stays with me. She was right. She just did not know yet how long right was going to take. If you are in a January 9th of your own, if you are in the room before the knock, if you are writing down what happened, because the training holds even when everything else is uncertain, you may be further along than you think. Keep writing it down. Keep going. The snow as a rule does not last forever, and what you are building in the cold, quietly, line by line on a legal pad in a borrowed room, may matter more than anything else in what comes next. Before I go, I want to mention something practical, because practical matters. If you or someone you know is navigating a situation involving financial control in a relationship, coerced legal documents, or custody proceedings where you feel outgunned and under-resourced, there are real options. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-SAFE. Legal aid organizations in every state provide family law assistance regardless of income. The links in the description below include a state-by-state resource guide and a document I put together specifically around financial documentation in high-conflict family situations. If this story meant something to you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, not for the drama of it, for the Ruth Caldwell detail, for the 11 days of silence, for the notes application on the phone in a hospital room at midnight. Those are the real things. Those are what survive. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of each other. We have reached the end of Sarah's story, but I want to stay here for a moment because I think the most important part of what we just heard is not the courtroom. It is not the inheritance. It is not the legal victories or the newspaper headline or the moment the fraud was exposed. The most important moment in this entire story happened in a hospital room at midnight, when a woman who had just been told her marriage was a transaction picked up her phone and opened her notes application and started writing. She did not know what she was building. She did not know where it would lead. She only knew what her training had taught her, that what is documented is real, and what is real can be used. That is the thing I want you to carry out of this story. Not the inheritance, not the revenge, the notes application. Here is what Sarah Whitmore taught me, and what I hope this story has shown you. First, the people who try to make you feel powerless are almost always relying on you not knowing what you are actually capable of. Isolation, financial control, institutional manipulation. These are not signs of strength on their part. They are signs of fear. They are the tools of people who know, on some level, that if you ever clearly see your own resources, the game changes. Keep a clear accounting of what you actually have, the skills, the knowledge, the records, the relationships that remain after the managed ones fall away. Second, the most dangerous moments are the ones that feel like help arriving from someone else's direction. Craig Donovan was presented as assistance. He was a monitoring system. Before you accept guidance from anyone in a crisis, ask who sent them, who they have historically served, and what they gain from your cooperation. This is not paranoia. This is the most basic form of self-protection available to any of us. You are allowed to ask whose side someone is on. Third, Ruth Caldwell. I keep coming back to Ruth Caldwell because she is the part of the story that does not make the headline, but is the reason the headline exists. In almost every situation where powerful people are doing something wrong, there is a person like her, invisible to the people who consider themselves important, present for everything, meticulous by habit, when you need the truth. Start with the person who had no reason to manage their records because nobody thought they mattered enough to bother. Fourth, you control your own timeline. The pressure to respond, to defend, to make noise immediately is one of the most effective weapons available to people who have wronged you. They want your reaction before you have your documentation. They want your voice without your evidence. Sarah waited 11 days, not because she was passive, because she was loading. Silence, used strategically, is not the absence of power. It is the accumulation of it. And fifth, the one that is hardest to hold on to when you are in the middle of it. The capabilities that were used against you, the intelligence, the training, the instinct to write things down, the ability to recognize a pattern, the refusal to hand over more than absolutely necessary, those did not belong to your marriage. They did not belong to the family you married into. They were not given to you by anyone who later tried to take them back. They were yours before, they remained yours throughout, and they are yours now. Sarah Whitmore was not made strong by $340 million. She was made visible by it. The strength was always there. 3 years of being told otherwise had made it quiet. But quiet is not gone, and the moment she needed it, it was exactly where she had left it. If you are in your own January 9th right now, if you are in the moment before the knock on the door, if you are lying in the dark wondering what you actually have left to work with, I want you to hear this. You have more than you think, and the first step is not a dramatic one. It is the smallest possible version of what Sarah did. Open your notes application, write down the date, write down what just happened. Start the record, because the record is where everything begins, and it costs nothing, and it is already in your hand. Thank you for staying until the end. That tells me something about you. It tells me you are the kind of person who is looking for the real thing underneath the story. I hope you found it today. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and if this gave you something worth keeping, carry it forward. That is the only thing I would ever ask. Closing statement. The story you just heard, every scene, every character detail, every piece of dialogue, every lesson embedded within it, was researched, constructed, and edited entirely by hand. No automated generation, no template, no shortcut. Every word was chosen deliberately, with one purpose: to bring you something that is worth your time. We believe that real stories, told with real care, have the power to reach people in real moments. That is the only standard we hold ourselves to. Thank you for trusting us with your attention. It is not something we take lightly.